The most terrifying part of being a night shift security guard isn't the darkness or the isolation. It's the moment you realize that the person you've been talking to on the radio all night might not be the same person or even the same thing that's standing right behind you. In 2017, I accepted a position that most people would have turned down within the first hour of seeing the location. I was stationed as an outdoor security guard at a massive industrial warehouse facility. To say it was isolated would be an understatement. The property sat a full half-mile off the main highway, nestled deep within the center of a sprawling, overgrown field that seemed to swallow the light from the moon. It was miles away from the nearest signs of civilization, leaving us on a concrete island surrounded by a sea of dead grass. The architecture of the place did nothing to ease the mind. The entire perimeter was reinforced with high-grade fencing, topped with coiled wire that made the warehouse look less like a center for commerce and more like a maximum security prison. There were only two ways in or out: the primary main gate at the front where I was stationed, and a smaller, more secluded gate at the rear of the facility. My reality for 10 hours every night was a tiny, cramped security box, a glass and metal cage where I was tasked with ensuring that the silence of the night remained undisturbed. The only thing that kept me sane during those long, oppressive shifts was Corey. He was the guard assigned to the back gate. Because our posts were on opposite sides of the massive complex, we rarely saw each other in person. Our entire relationship was built on the crackle of the radio frequency. We would spend hours exchanging jokes, discussing our lives, and complaining about the monotony of the job. It was our way of pushing back against the crushing weight of the silence that settled over the field. Physical patrols were technically unnecessary. The company had installed a high-tech network of live camera feeds that covered the entire perimeter. From the comfort of our booths, we could monitor every inch of the fence line on our monitors. Most nights were predictable. A few late-night employees would badge in, or a weary truck driver would arrive for a midnight delivery. But once the clock struck midnight, the facility usually became a graveyard. The night everything changed began like any other. I clocked in at 10:00 p.m., processed a few routine entries, and settled in for the long haul. By midnight, the world outside my booth had gone completely still. I was leaning back, expecting another 8 hours of boredom when the radio hissed to life. It was Corey, but his voice lacked its usual jovial tone. He asked me if I had heard it, a sound he described as a piercing human scream coming from the darkness beyond the gates. I laughed it off at first, assuming he was trying to prank me to break the boredom. I told him I hadn't heard a thing. However, Corey didn't laugh back. He sounded shaken, his voice trembling as he insisted that someone was yelling just outside the perimeter of his gate. I immediately turned my attention to the monitors, frantically switching between the live feeds. I scanned the high-definition images of the fence, looking for a trespasser, a stranded motorist, or anything that shouldn't be there. The cameras showed nothing but the gray, flickering landscape of the empty field. I told Corey that the feeds were clear and that he was likely just hearing the wind whipping through the warehouse rafters. 15 minutes passed in a tense, uncomfortable silence. I kept my eyes glued to the screens, waiting for a glitch or a shadow to move. Then Corey's voice erupted from the radio again, shouting my name with a level of urgency that made my blood run cold. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he asked a single chilling question. "Do you see that?" I stood up in my booth, peering through the glass into the pitch-black field. At first, there was nothing. Then I saw it. A beam of light like a powerful flashlight was cutting through the darkness. It wasn't on the warehouse grounds, it was out in the middle of the field, moving with an erratic, swaying motion. It was too far away to see the person holding it, but the light was unmistakable, a solitary, searching eye in the void. Corey confirmed he was seeing it on his feed as well. We compared notes, trying to determine who would be wandering through a waist-deep field of grass a half-mile from the highway at 1:00 a.m. We watched the light for nearly an hour as it bobbed and weaved, seemingly searching for something hidden in the dirt. Eventually, the light drifted into a blind spot, a section of the field where the cameras couldn't reach and our booth lights couldn't penetrate. We waited for it to emerge on the other side, but the light never reappeared. The silence returned, but this time it felt heavy, like a held breath. As the clock ticked toward 3:00 a.m., the atmosphere grew thick with a sense of impending dread. I found myself checking the locks on my small security booth repeatedly, though I knew the heavy glass was reinforced. I tried to reach Corey several times over the radio just to hear a human voice, but he seemed preoccupied, giving only short, clipped responses. The camaraderie that usually defined our shifts had evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical focus on the monitors. I felt as though the warehouse itself was leaning in, watching the field along with us. Every small noise, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant drone of the highway, the shifting of the metal building, sounded like a potential threat. I was trapped in a state of high alert, my mind racing through possibilities ranging from copper thieves to something far more sinister. I didn't realize it then, but the light in the field was merely a distraction, a lure designed to pull us away from the safety of our stations and into the waiting dark. The true nightmare began at exactly 3:05 a.m. The silence was broken not by a scream or a light, but by a sound I had become so accustomed to that it took a moment to register: the static click of my radio. Someone had keyed the mic on the other end, but no words followed. I picked up my handset, calling out for Corey, but was met with nothing but 5 seconds of empty air before the connection cut. When I looked at the monitors to check on his booth at the back gate, my heart skipped a beat. The chair inside his booth was empty. Corey was gone. I toggled through the camera views, searching for his high-visibility vest in the corridors or around the perimeter, but the facility was a ghost town. It was then that I realized the small security box that had felt like a fortress only moments ago was actually a cage, and I was the only one left to guard it. The light in the field had been silent for an hour, but now the disappearance of my only companion made the darkness outside feel alive, as if it were pressed right against the glass, waiting for me to step out. I picked up my radio, calling out for Corey repeatedly, but the only response was a hollow, empty silence that seemed to echo through the small booth. My heart began to race as I stared at the monitors, switching frantically between the feeds covering the back gate. The high-definition cameras showed his station clearly, but the chair was pushed back and there was no sign of him anywhere. I waited for 10 agonizing minutes, hoping he had just stepped away for a moment, but the screen remained still. Unable to sit still any longer, I accessed the digital backlogs and rewound the footage to 3:00 a.m., exactly when my radio had first clicked on. My eyes widened in disbelief as I watched Corey suddenly stand up and exit his booth. He didn't look panicked, he looked like he was being called. He walked to the exit door, unlocked it, and stepped out of the safety of the complex and directly into the blackness of the field. He stood there for a brief second, reaching for his radio as if to say something, but then he simply tucked it away and vanished into the dark. I scrubbed through the next 20 minutes of footage, but he never returned. A wave of genuine worry washed over me, overriding the company rules that strictly forbade leaving my station. I knew I should have probably called the police right then, but a part of me was desperate for this to be some elaborate, stupid joke. I didn't want to deal with the mountain of paperwork and corporate headaches that come with a police report if Corey was just around the corner waiting to laugh at me. I abandoned my booth and began the long, nervous trek across the dark warehouse grounds toward the back gate. When I arrived, the back booth was exactly as I had seen it on the monitor, cold, empty, and silent. I pushed open the heavy exit door and stepped into the field, the tall grass whispering against my boots. Just as I stepped out, my radio clicked on again. I held it to my ear, holding my breath, but no voice came through, just the faint, rhythmic sound of breathing, or perhaps just the wind catching the microphone. I began to shout Corey's name into the void, my voice cracking under the pressure of the isolation. I stood there for a full minute, yelling until my throat felt raw, but the field offered no answer. Then suddenly a light cut through the distance. It was the same erratic flashlight beam we had seen earlier near my gate, but now it was far out toward the dense tree line that bordered the back of the property. I took a few impulsive steps toward the light, my mind telling me to run and help my friend, but my body suddenly froze. An overwhelming, sickening sensation hit my gut, a primal instinct screaming at me that something was fundamentally wrong. I realized then that if I kept walking into that field, I might never walk back out. I turned and sprinted back to the security station, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I grabbed the landline and dialed for emergency assistance. As I waited for the sirens to pierce the silence, I stood by the window and watched the distant light grow dimmer and dimmer. It moved steadily away deeper into the trees until it eventually flickered once and faded into nothingness. Corey was still missing when the police arrived. The authorities and the company launched a massive investigation, scouring every inch of that field and the surrounding woods, but they found absolutely nothing. No footprints, no dropped radio, and no Corey. The official theory was that he had simply grown curious about the trespasser and went to confront them, only to meet with foul play. But I saw the footage, I saw how he walked. It didn't look like curiosity. It looked like he was walking towards something he recognized or something that had a hold on him. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. I often think about the fact that it could have been me at the back gate. If the light had appeared closer to my station first, or if I had been the one to hear that scream, I would be the one whose name is now just a file in a cold case drawer. I've worked many security jobs since then in all sorts of environments, but nothing has ever matched the sheer, quiet terror of that night in the field. Whatever took Corey is still out there, and I know better than anyone that sometimes the things we see in the dark aren't looking for a way in, they are waiting for us to come out. The arrival of the police didn't bring the sense of relief I had expected. Instead, the flashing blue and red lights against the industrial metal of the warehouse felt like a spotlight on a crime scene that shouldn't have existed. They spent hours combing through the tall grass, their heavy boots trampling the very spots where I had seen the mysterious light dancing. They found nothing. There were no flattened patches of grass to suggest a struggle, no dropped equipment, and most unsettling of all, no footprints other than my own leading out from the gate. It was as if Corey had simply evaporated into the humid night air. The lead officer kept asking me if Corey had been depressed or if he had mentioned wanting to disappear, but I knew that wasn't it. Corey was looking forward to his sister's wedding that weekend. He wasn't a man planning a vanishing act. The following days were a blur of corporate inquiries and police statements. The warehouse management was more concerned with the liability of a missing employee than the actual safety of the remaining staff. They reviewed the footage I had watched, but in the harsh light of day, the grainy black and white images seemed less like a supernatural abduction and more like a strange lapse in judgment. The official report eventually listed Corey as a missing person, suggesting he had walked off the job and succumbed to the elements or foul play in the woods. But they couldn't explain the light. They couldn't explain why the cameras didn't pick up a second person or even a vehicle near the tree line. To the authorities, it was a cold case. To the company, it was a position that needed to be filled. I resigned less than 48 hours after the incident. I couldn't bring myself to sit in that glass booth again, staring at the monitors and waiting for a radio to click on that I knew would never carry Corey's voice again. I moved to a different city and took a job in a well-lit retail complex, surrounded by people and cameras that actually saw things clearly. Yet, the transition didn't stop the nightmares. Every time I find myself in a quiet place after midnight, my ears strain for the sound of static. I find myself looking at empty fields and wondering what lies just beyond the reach of the streetlights. I realized that the warehouse wasn't just a building, it was a border, and on that night, Corey had crossed it. Years have passed, and I recently heard through an old colleague that the warehouse facility was eventually shut down. Apparently, several other guards had reported visual anomalies in that same field: strange lights, the sound of someone calling their name from the grass, and a persistent feeling of being watched from the blind spots of the camera network. The property is now overgrown, the fences rusted and sagging, reclaimed by the very field that swallowed Corey. Some people say the land was cursed long before the warehouse was built, while others think it was just a string of coincidences fueled by the isolation of the night shift. I know the truth is something far more grounded and terrifying. We like to believe that the world is mapped out and safe, that there is a logical explanation for every shadow. But that night taught me that there are places where logic doesn't apply. I am the only one who remembers the specific rhythm of that breathing on the radio and the way the light in the field seemed to beckon rather than search. I got lucky because I was at the front gate, protected by a little more distance and a little more hesitation. Corey's chair remains empty in my mind, a permanent reminder that in the dead of night, some secrets are better left in the dark, and some lights should never be followed.